In September 1943, bread rationing hit the United Kingdom for the first time in the entire war. Not in 1939, when the bombs started falling. Not in 1940, during the Blitz. Not even during the darkest years of U-boat blockades that starved the island of nearly everything else. Bread was the last thing the British government dared to touch, because bread was not just food. It was the line beneath which a civilization refused to fall. When officials finally rationed it in 1946, after the war had already ended, London saw actual riots in the streets. People who had endured 5 years of German bombs took to the streets over slices of loaf. That tells you something about what bread actually is to human beings. But the story of bread does not start in a British bakery. It starts in a marsh 23,000 years ago on the shores of a lake that no longer exists. Northeastern Jordan, the edge of the Black Desert, in what archaeologists now call the site of Shabaka. Long before anyone planted a single seed on purpose, hunter-gatherer communities were gathering wild wheat and barley grasses growing along the water's edge. They ground the grains between stones, mixed the resulting flour with water, and pressed the paste flat against hot stones near open fires. What came out was not fluffy, not risen, nothing like a modern loaf. It was a dense cracker like flatbread. And in 2018, archaeologists found the charred remains of exactly this bread, for 1,000 years older than the earliest known evidence of farming itself. Humans were baking bread before humans were even growing the grain to make it. That single fact rewrote what scientists thought they understood about the origins of agriculture. For decades, the assumption had been that farming came first and bread came after, a convenient byproduct of settled life. The Shabaka discovery flipped that order entirely. It suggested something stranger and more human. That the taste of bread itself, the craving for it, may have been one of the very reasons people decided to stop wandering and start planting. By around 10,000 BC, in the region historians call the Fertile Crescent, spanning modern-day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, humans made the leap from gathering wild grain to deliberately cultivating it. Wheat and barley were among the very first plants any human society ever domesticated, and once people were tied to a field, they were tied to a place. Villages formed. Villages became towns. Grain storage required organization, and organization required rules, and rules required something resembling government. Some archaeologists now argue that bread, or more specifically the demand for a stable grain supply, was one of the foundational sparks of civilization itself. Not gold, not bronze, a crumbly flatbread baked on hot stone. Ancient Egypt is where bread stopped being a survival food and became something closer to a religion. Sometime around 3000 BC, an unknown Egyptian baker made a discovery that would change the entire trajectory of human food. Wild yeast, floating invisibly in the air, landed in a bowl of wet dough that had been left out too long. Instead of throwing it away, someone baked it anyway. The result puffed up, turned golden, and tasted completely different from anything that had come before. Soft, airy, alive. The Egyptians had accidentally discovered leavened bread, and they leaned into it with total obsession. Archaeologists have identified more than 40 distinct types of bread depicted in Egyptian tomb paintings and hieroglyphics, shaped like animals, braided into elaborate patterns, sweetened with honey and dates. Bread was so central to Egyptian identity that Egyptian workers were sometimes paid in loaves instead of coin, and the Greeks later mocked Egyptians by nicknaming them artophagoi, bread eaters. Bread accompanied the dead into the afterlife, packed into tombs alongside beer, because Egyptians believed the deceased would need sustenance on the other side. The pyramids themselves, according to some historians, may have been built by workers fed largely on a diet of bread and beer, both made from the same fermented grain. The Greeks inherited Egyptian bread-making knowledge and refined it into something almost aristocratic. By the height of Athenian civilization, professional bakers called artikopoi operated dedicated bread shops across the city, and different breads carried different social weight. Coarse, dark barley bread was for the poor and for soldiers on campaign. Fine white wheat bread, difficult and expensive to produce, was reserved for the wealthy and for religious offerings to the gods. The philosopher Plato reportedly worried that refined white bread made citizens soft and morally weak, an early and slightly absurd version of a debate about processed food that is still happening today. Rome took bread and turned it into political infrastructure. By the height of the Roman Empire, the state was distributing free or heavily subsidized grain and bread to hundreds of thousands of citizens in the capital, a program historians call the annona. This was not charity in the modern sense. It was a calculated tool of political control. Grain arrived by ship from Egypt and North Africa, Rome's breadbasket provinces, in fleets so critical to the city's survival that losing a single harvest season to bad weather or piracy could trigger riots in the streets within weeks. Emperors lived and died politically by the reliability of that grain supply, and more than one Roman official found his career, or his life, ended by a bread shortage he had failed to prevent. The phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses, was coined by the poet Juvenal as a bitter accusation. He argued that Roman emperors kept the population docile and distracted not through good governance, but through free food and entertainment. Rome built entire guilds around bread production. Roman bakers, called pisters, were so essential to the functioning of the empire that the job was made hereditary by imperial decree. Sons were legally required to become bakers because their fathers had been bakers, and the state could not risk the supply chain breaking down. When Rome fell in 476 AD, one of the most immediate and visible consequences across the former empire was the collapse of large-scale bread distribution, and famine followed in cities that had depended on it for centuries. Medieval Europe turned bread into a marker of rigid social hierarchy, more explicitly than any civilization before it. The color of your bread told everyone around you exactly where you stood. The wealthy and the nobility ate pain de froment, pale white bread made from finely sifted wheat flour. Peasants ate dark, coarse bread made from rye, barley, or a rough mixture of whatever grain happened to be available that season, sometimes stretched with ground acorns or beans during lean years. In some regions, particularly in medieval France and England, poor communities used enormous round loaves of stale, rock-hard bread as literal plates, called trenchers. Food was piled directly on top of the bread, the juices soaking in, and at the end of the meal, the sodden trencher itself was eaten or, more often, thrown to the dogs or given to beggars waiting at the gate. Bread ovens were frequently owned by the local lord or the church, not by individual families, and peasants were legally required to pay a fee just to bake their own dough in the communal oven. This system had a name, banalite, and it turned something as basic as baking into another mechanism of feudal control. It was in medieval Europe that bread also became sacred in an entirely new way. The Catholic Church built one of its most central rituals directly around bread. During the sacrament of the Eucharist, a wafer of unleavened bread is consecrated and, according to Catholic doctrine, transformed into the body of Christ. This single ritual, repeated in churches across the continent every single day for over 1,000 years, cemented bread's position not just as food, but as the literal intersection of the physical and the divine. For most of human history, bread making remained a slow, physically brutal process. Grinding grain by hand with stone querns could take hours to produce enough flour for a single family's daily loaf. Watermills and windmills, which spread gradually across Europe and the Islamic world starting around the 6th century, eased that burden but did not eliminate it. Kneading dough by hand for large batches was exhausting labor, typically assigned to the lowest status workers in any bakery or household. Bread was baked in wood-fired brick ovens that took hours to heat properly, and a single miscalculation of temperature could ruin an entire day's batch. This changed almost nothing for nearly 10,000 years until the Industrial Revolution arrived and rewrote the rules within a single century. Steam-powered mills, introduced in the late 1700s and early 1800s, could grind grain into flour at a scale and speed no human or animal-powered mill had ever approached. Roller mills, which replaced traditional grindstones starting in the 1870s, produced a finer, whiter flour far more efficiently. And for the first time in history, white bread became cheap enough for ordinary working families to afford regularly, not just the wealthy. This triggered an unexpected nutritional crisis. The industrial roller milling process stripped away the wheat germ and bran, and with them, most of the grain's natural vitamins and minerals. Diseases linked to nutrient deficiency, including pellagra and beriberi, rose sharply in populations that had shifted almost entirely to refined white flour. Governments in Britain and the United States eventually mandated that milled flour be fortified with synthetic vitamins and iron to correct a problem the Industrial Revolution itself had created. Then, in 1928, a machine changed everything again. Otto Frederick Reuter, an Iowa jeweler-turned-inventor, had spent over a decade developing a machine that could slice an entire loaf of bread uniformly and hold the slices together long enough to package them. His first prototype was destroyed in a factory fire in 1917, and it took him another decade of rebuilding before the machine finally worked. When the Chillicothe Baking Company in Missouri debuted the first commercially sold sliced bread in July of 1928, the local newspaper described it as the greatest forward step in the baking industry since bread was wrapped. Sales in that single bakery reportedly jumped by more than 2,000% within 2 weeks. The phrase "greatest thing since sliced bread" entered the English language almost immediately, and within a decade, over 80% of bread sold in America was pre-sliced. But the industrialization of bread came with a hidden cost that took decades to fully surface. As factories optimized for shelf life, cost, and speed, traditional slow fermentation, the kind that had defined bread making for thousands of years, was largely abandoned. Commercial bakeries switched to fast-acting industrial yeast strains that could proof a loaf in under an hour instead of the many hours or even days that natural fermentation required. This produced bread that was cheap, soft, and nearly identical from loaf to loaf, but nutritionally hollow compared to its ancestors, and increasingly linked by modern researchers to digestive issues in people who struggled to tolerate gluten in its fast-fermented industrial form. Sourdough, the ancient method relying on wild airborne yeast and slow natural fermentation, nearly vanished from commercial production entirely by the mid-20th century, surviving mostly in small regional bakeries and immigrant communities that refused to abandon the old methods. Bread has also been weaponized, quite literally, throughout modern history. During the siege of Leningrad in World War II, which lasted nearly 900 days, the Soviet government rationed bread down to as little as 125 grams per day for civilians, roughly the size of a deck of playing cards, made from a grim mixture of rye flour, sawdust, and cottonseed cake stretched to feed a starving city. An estimated 1 million people died during the siege, and bread, or the desperate lack of it, sat at the very center of that catastrophe. During the French Revolution, just over a century earlier, chronic bread shortages and skyrocketing prices were among the most immediate triggers of public fury against the monarchy. Marie Antoinette never actually said, "Let them eat cake." Historians have thoroughly debunked that myth. But the phrase endured for centuries precisely because it captured something true: that bread scarcity, more than almost any other single grievance, has repeatedly proven capable of toppling governments. Today, the picture has flipped in an unexpected direction. In wealthy nations, bread has swung from a symbol of survival to, for a growing number of people, a symbol of excess and suspicion. Low-carb diets, gluten-free trends, and a booming artisanal sourdough movement, one that exploded dramatically during the pandemic lockdowns of 2020, when home baking searches spiked by over 400%, have all reshaped how modern consumers relate to a food that fed every civilization before ours. And yet, globally, bread remains one of the most consumed foods on the entire planet. Wheat, the grain most bread depends on, is grown on more land than any other crop on Earth, and billions of people across nearly every culture still eat some form of bread, with nearly every meal, from Indian naan to Ethiopian injera to French baguettes to Mexican bolillos. In France alone, a country that has legally protected the definition of a traditional baguette since 1993, bakeries sell an estimated 6 billion baguettes every single year. And in 2022, UNESCO added the baguette itself to its list of intangible cultural heritage, an official global acknowledgement that a simple loaf of bread could carry the weight of an entire nation's identity. Bread started as a hunter-gatherer's accident beside a vanished lake in the desert. 23,000 years ago, thousands of years before anyone thought to plant a seed on purpose. It became the currency of pharaohs, the political tool of emperors, the sacred body of Christ, the marker of medieval class, and the ration that could start a revolution or end a siege. It survived industrialization, it survived war, and it is currently surviving a cultural backlash from the very civilizations it built. Not bad, for a paste of ground grass seeds and water, pressed flat against a hot stone by someone who had absolutely no idea what they were starting. If you enjoyed this, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which part of bread's history surprised you the most. And make sure to like this video so more people can find it.